1944, northern France. A blackout settles over a railway yard held behind layers of fencing and dim patrol lamps. From the shadows beneath a coal hopper, two figures watch a sentry pacing his narrow arc. The man is alone, but a single shot from an ordinary pistol would carry across the yard and bring a dozen rifles to life. For months, resistance groups have learned this lesson at great cost. Noise travels faster than escape. The sentry turns, only the faintest mechanical click swallowed by the damp night air. The guard sags silently to the ground, unseen by his comrades just meters away. Somewhere in that quiet moment lies the story of a British device engineered not merely to fire, but to disappear into silence itself. This is the Welrod. But to understand how we got to this point, we must first go back to the one moment that made the Welrod a genuine reality. By 1941, the landscape of clandestine warfare in Europe had hardened into a grim reality. Resistance groups were growing, but so too were the methods used to detect and destroy them. Roadblocks, curfews, rapid response patrols, and punitive reprisals meant that any action involving gunfire, even a single shot, risked catastrophic consequences for entire communities. The Special Operations Executive understood this with painful clarity. Their task was to enable sabotage, to support uprisings, and to remove key individuals whose work strengthened the occupation. But each of those aims collided with the same unforgiving constraint: silence. Conventional pistols, even with the crude suppressors available at the time, could not deliver it. A typical sidearm produced a report loud enough to be recognized across a village street. Suppressed Sten guns remained conspicuous, heavy, and acoustically distinct in enclosed spaces. Even purpose-built, integrally suppressed rifles were far too large for the close confines in which clandestine work actually occurred. And blades, though silent, imposed their own narrow conditions: proximity, strength, and a willingness to engage in a struggle that could go wrong in an instant. It became increasingly obvious that the war in occupied Europe demanded a weapon for which no existing pattern offered a template, something that could be carried discreetly, drawn without signaling intent, and used at arm's length without raising an alarm. The difficulty was not merely technical, it was conceptual. How does one engineer a firearm to produce less sound than a whispered conversation, yet still deliver reliable lethality at the short distances dictated by urban clandestine work? The physics of gunfire fought every attempt. Combustion produced gas, gas produced pressure, pressure produced noise. Even if the muzzle blast could be managed, the sharp crack of a bullet exceeding the speed of sound would betray the shot. And even if both could be overcome, the mechanical clatter of a semi-automatic slide was enough to alert anyone nearby. The result was a series of half-solutions, each addressing one part of the problem while leaving the others unacceptably exposed. By late 1941, the requirement was distilled into a specification that bordered on the impossible: a weapon whose signature, in both sight and sound, must be so subdued that it could be used in a crowded building without drawing attention beyond a few paces. It had to be simple, concealable, mechanically dependable, and operable under extreme stress. And above all, it had to enable action in places where hesitation meant discovery. This was the void into which Britain's covert engineering establishments were asked to step, a challenge that demanded not refinement of an existing weapon, but the creation of something wholly different. And so attention turned to a small, quietly industrious workshop, where unconventional problems were not merely tolerated but expected. The responsibility for solving the problem of silent lethality fell to an organization that specialized in approaches the conventional arms industry would not entertain. The Inter-Services Research Bureau, the administrative cover for SOE's technical development, operated a number of discrete facilities, each with its own specialisms. Among them was a site on the outskirts of Welwyn, centered on an old country house known as the Frythe. Here, teams worked in small compartmentalized groups, drawing on toolrooms, workshops, and makeshift test chambers that existed almost entirely outside the peacetime traditions of British gunmaking. Their challenge was unusual from the outset. A conventional pistol could not simply be suppressed more efficiently. It carried too many mechanical actions, too many sonic signatures, and too much reliance on ammunition never designed for stealth. The engineers were therefore compelled to begin, not with a finished firearm to be modified, but with a blank sheet, a rare freedom created by wartime necessity. What emerged in these early discussions was a philosophy rather than a form. The weapon should be defined by its acoustic requirements, not by established notions of what a pistol ought to be. This principle guided the first experiments. According to surviving records, engineers studied gas expansion patterns using sections of tubing, improvised baffles, and captured ammunition. They examined how pressure could be eased progressively rather than released in a single violent pulse. The intention was to allow the firing cycle itself to become a controlled bleed of energy. At the same time, any mechanism that produced more noise than it saved was ruthlessly removed. Semi-automatic operation, with its metallic slide and reciprocating components, was rejected immediately. In its place came the idea of a manually operated bolt, mechanically slow but nearly silent. Ammunition formed the second pillar of development. Subsonic .32 ACP cartridges were widely available, commercially produced, and inherently quiet in flight. But tests suggested that while the caliber was feasible, greater stopping power would be invaluable in operations where a second shot might be neither possible nor prudent. Reduced charge 9mm parabellum ammunition therefore became central to the design, with the understanding that it must remain below the speed of sound to avoid producing the telltale crack of high-velocity rounds. Balancing charge weight, bullet mass, and pressure became a meticulous process, part measurement, part experience, and at times part informed inference recorded only in laboratory notebooks that no longer survive. The first prototypes bore little resemblance to the iconic shape recognized today. Some were no more than tubes with rudimentary chambers. Others experimented with varying lengths of baffled sections and different materials for internal sealing elements. Early tests revealed that each shot eroded the suppressive medium, gradually increasing noise. This limitation, though never fully eliminated, was accepted as an operational trade-off. The requirement was not to fire dozens of rounds in succession, but to deliver a small number of decisive shots under controlled conditions. Within that constraint, the prototypes performed well enough to justify refinement. As the months passed, the design matured into a practical form, a cylindrical suppressor forming the majority of the weapon's length, a simple magazine built into a detachable grip, and a bolt that could be turned and drawn to cycle the chamber without producing more than a faint mechanical sound. It was unconventional, visually plain, and thoroughly without ornament, reflecting the ethos of the Fryth team. Utility above all. Security shrouded the entire process. Engineers often worked on components without being told their final purpose. Serial numbering conventions were intentionally scattered, and documentation was restricted to essential notes. Even within SOE, only those with direct involvement understood precisely what was being created. And while the weapon would later be associated with the name Welrod, contemporary records show that such designations were often informal, drawn from a system of well prefixes used for devices developed in the Welwyn area. By the time the final prototypes were approved, the engineers understood they had not merely suppressed a pistol, they had redefined what a suppressed weapon could be. The next step was to move from concept to a finished tool suitable for clandestine distribution. What emerged from that effort would prove unlike any other firearm of the war, a device whose outward simplicity concealed an intricate purpose. From the work at the Fryth emerged a weapon that seemed at first glance almost too ordinary to warrant attention. A plain cylinder, a detachable grip, a small bolt at the rear. Nothing about its appearance hinted at its intended purpose. Yet this unassuming object represented one of the most specialized instruments produced by Britain during the war. It would become known as the Welrod. Its purpose was singular: to give clandestine operatives a means of firing a lethal shot with the least possible acoustic signature. The Welrod was not designed for rapid fire, nor for intimidation, nor for open combat. It existed to be carried discreetly, to be raised only when absolutely necessary, and to function in the quiet spaces where a conventional pistol would compromise the mission before the trigger was pulled. The long suppressor formed the majority of the weapon's profile, while the bolt-action mechanism ensured only a muted click accompanied cycling. The result was a tool defined not by firepower, but by restraint. In the context of clandestine warfare, this simplicity was its strength. Operatives could grip it naturally, conceal it easily, and rely on it to behave consistently under stress. Its intended ranges were short, across a room, along a stairwell, at the threshold of a guarded doorway, reflecting the environment's SOE teams and resistance groups navigated nightly. But appearance and purpose alone do not explain why the Welrod achieved its reputation. To understand its unusual effectiveness, one must look inside, at the engineering choices that shaped how it behaved, why it sounded as it did, and the compromises that defined its operational life. It is in those inner workings, quiet, careful, and exacting, that the true character of the Welrod is revealed. The Welrod's outward simplicity concealed an internal arrangement shaped by one overriding priority: acoustic control. To achieve this, its design combined several engineering decisions that, taken together, allowed it to operate at a level of discretion far beyond ordinary suppressed firearms. Yet each of these elements introduced limits of its own, resulting in a weapon whose character was defined as much by its constraints as by its ingenuity. At the core of the design sat an integrally suppressed barrel. Rather than attaching a silencer to a standard pistol, the Frythe engineers built the suppressor as the weapon itself. The barrel extended deep into a cylindrical housing containing a sequence of baffles and expansion chambers. Historical documentation is fragmentary, but surviving examples show that early models used rubber or neoprene wipes, thin discs through which the bullet passed, momentarily sealing behind it to contain gas. These wipes degraded with use, providing exceptional quiet for the first few shots before gradually allowing more sound to escape. This was not a flaw so much as an accepted trade-off. The Welrod was intended for very limited engagements, not sustained fire. Behind the suppressor sat the manually operated bolt. It was a simple rotating mechanism: turn, draw, push, lock. Operating it produced only a subdued mechanical click, far quieter than the slide of a semi-automatic pistol. The lack of automatic cycling eliminated the noise of a case being ejected and a new round chambered. It also removed the risk of accidental second shots caused by stress or sympathetic reflex, an often overlooked consideration in clandestine settings where noise discipline was vital. The engineering payoff was silence. The operational cost was speed, for each shot required deliberate manual cycling. The grip, detachable from the main cylinder, housed the magazine. This arrangement allowed the weapon to be broken down into discrete components for concealment, an aspect consistent with SOE's broader design philosophy for clandestine equipment. Variants differed in capacity, but surviving examples show magazines typically holding 6 to 8 rounds. A simple push-button latch secured the grip in place, allowing an operative to replace it swiftly if required, though in practice, very few situations would have demanded it. Ammunition represented one of the most carefully balanced aspects of the design. While .32 ACP versions existed and offered inherently subsonic performance, the 9mm variant became the best known. To avoid the supersonic crack, the standard 9mm cartridge was reduced in charge weight, bringing its velocity below the speed of sound. This reduction limited effective range but maintained sufficient terminal performance for close quarters use. Records are not explicit about the exact loading specifications, but comparisons with other SOE development work suggest that charge levels were matched carefully to the suppressor's internal pressure characteristics, an inference supported by the consistency with which restored examples perform in modern testing. To prevent dangerous overpressure when the muzzle was pressed directly against a target, a technique sometimes used in close work, the Welrod included a small recess at the muzzle. This prevented the suppressor from sealing completely against fabric or skin, allowing gases to vent correctly. This detail, easily overlooked in photographs, reflected the Frythe engineers' awareness of the practical conditions in which operatives might find themselves. Sight arrangements were deliberately rudimentary, a fixed front blade and a shallow rear notch. At the ranges for which the Welrod was designed, often only a few meters, precision sights offered little benefit. More important was a natural presentation, allowing an operative to align the weapon instinctively without calling attention to it. The cylindrical profile and understated finish served the same purpose. The weapon did not advertise itself. As effective as the Welrod was in its specialized role, its limitations were inherent. The suppressor's internal elements wore with each shot, increasing the noise level predictably. The manual cycling slowed follow-up shots and demanded composure, and accuracy declined notably at longer ranges due to the reduced charge ammunition and short sight radius. These constraints meant that the Welrod was not a general-purpose sidearm, but a narrow solution for narrowly defined tasks. Yet even within those constraints, the engineering achievements were considerable. The Fryth team had produced a firearm that could operate at a sound level more akin to a mechanical click than a conventional gunshot, that could be concealed in sections, and that could retain reliability despite its unconventional architecture. To understand its impact, one must return to the conditions in which it was born. The railway yard is unchanged. The same damp air, the same dim patrol lamps, the same narrow corridor of movement beneath the coal hopper. But now the quiet shape in an operative's hand is no longer a mystery. Its cylindrical form, its modest sights, its deliberate bolt, each element finds its purpose in this moment. The Welrod is lifted only as high as needed, its finish blending with the night, its presence hidden even at arm's length. Across the fence, voices move in conversation, one patrol relieving another. A single shout, a single report would undo weeks of preparation. Yet the weapon offers no such risk. When the operative presses forward, the recessed muzzle clears cloth without sealing. The reduced charge round will not crack against the cold spring air. The suppressor's first shots will remain at their most effective. Within these margins of silence, the resistance team can advance without drawing the yard's attention into a blaze of searchlights. The sentry moves into his familiar turning circle, unaware of the absence behind him where a faint mechanical click has replaced the vocabulary of ordinary gunfire. In that brief instant, the yard's balance shifts, an opening created not by force but by the narrow acoustic space the Welrod was engineered to occupy. Yet the true measure of the weapon lies not only in scenes like this, but in how it shaped operations, reputation and legacy across the wider clandestine war. By the time the Welrod entered limited production, its qualities had already been assessed in controlled conditions. Test reports, where they survive, describe an acoustic signature that began remarkably low, among the quietest of any wartime firearm, before gradually increasing as the suppressor's internal elements wore. The earliest shots were almost indistinguishable from the mechanical noise of the bolt itself. Accuracy at close distance was judged entirely adequate, though beyond modest ranges, the reduced charge ammunition imposed clear limitations. These characteristics aligned precisely with the conditions the weapon was expected to meet: short, deliberate engagements where silence outweighed reach or rapidity. Once distributed through SOE channels, the Welrod found its way into the hands of resistance groups across several occupied territories. The details of individual actions are understandably obscured by both secrecy and the passage of time, yet broad patterns are well attested. Operatives used the weapon to remove guards without alerting nearby patrols, to conduct isolated executive actions, and to create the brief openings needed for sabotage teams to penetrate industrial sites, railway yards, and storage depots. In these environments, the Welrod's chief strength, its subdued report, frequently proved decisive. Where a conventional shot would have triggered alarms, this device permitted operations to unfold in the narrow acoustic gap between awareness and response. Its impact, however, cannot be understood solely in terms of silence. The Welrod's appearance, deliberately plain and tubular, made it easy to disguise among everyday objects. The detachable grip could be carried separately, the cylinder placed among tools or household items, and the whole reassembled quickly when required. This adaptability suited the lived reality of clandestine work, where the line between survival and compromise often ran through the contents of a pocket or satchel. Operational feedback noted the expected drawbacks. The suppressor degraded after several rounds, leading to a progressive rise in noise. This was not a defect but an accepted limitation, and most operatives employed the weapon sparingly. The manual bolt demanded calm handling, though the absence of a reciprocating slide eliminated accidental noise and contributed to the weapon's reliability. and while early engagements benefited from its exceptional discretion, later shots, if required, demanded greater care in choosing the moment and environment. The Welrod was therefore not a sidearm for fluid skirmishing, but a precise tool for precise tasks. As the war progressed, Britain's clandestine priorities evolved. Larger weapons shipments, growing resistance capacity, and the increasing tempo of liberation operations shifted the emphasis from isolated silent actions to broader forms of disruption. Yet the Welrod retained a place in specialist inventories. Its occasional post-war sightings, including limited service among British special forces in later decades, according to credible accounts, suggest that its unusual characteristics continued to fill a narrow operational niche long after its initial context had passed. Today, surviving examples are held in museums in Britain and abroad, their stark appearance often surprising visitors accustomed to more conventional firearms. Curators note the difficulty in interpreting such devices without drifting into mythology. The Welrod was neither a miracle weapon nor a tool of widespread fear, but rather a specialist instrument shaped by the demands of resistance warfare. Historians generally emphasize its practicality, a modest engineering achievement applied with clear purpose. It demonstrated that silence could be engineered not through complexity, but through restraint, careful pressure management, and a willingness to discard conventions that had shaped pistol design for decades. In this, the Welrod exerted a subtle influence on later developments. Its integrally suppressed architecture foreshadowed modern approaches to concealable weapons, while its emphasis on subsonic ammunition and manual cycling echoed in subsequent experimental designs. More broadly, it stands as an example of how wartime innovation often thrives at the margins, where small teams, limited resources, and urgent needs combine to produce solutions that would never emerge in peacetime settings. But the true measure of this quiet device is best understood by returning once more to the kind of moment for which it was built, to the stillness, the risk, and the sudden shift of events when noise no longer dictates the outcome. The railway yard lies in darkness once more. The sentry who once paced its narrow path is gone, carried quietly into the stillness that surrounded him moments earlier. The yard's lamps flicker, untroubled. The distant voices of the changing patrol continue without alteration. In the cold air, nothing marks the event except the faint smell of coal dust and the slow settling of footsteps fading into the night. For the operatives moving away through the shadows, there is no triumph here, only the knowledge that silence has brought them the fragile window they required. The Welrod, now reassembled into its discrete parts, disappears back into a satchel without comment. It has done exactly what its designers intended. It has allowed action without alarm, decision without commotion, and risk without noise to betray it. Looking back on such scenes, the weapon's significance becomes clearer. Its value lay not in fear or notoriety, but in the narrow, disciplined space between sound and consequence. In these moments, it provided something rare in wartime, the ability to move against oppression without engulfing the innocent who lived beside it. And so the yard returns to quiet, unaware of the small, precise device that has shaped its night. The world will move on, the occupation will end, and the Welrod will be placed behind museum glass. But the silence it engineered remains a reminder of the extraordinary ingenuity demanded by a war fought so often in the dark. The story of the Welrod ends as it began, in stillness.